Ms. Huessy has joined me today to talk about her chapter titled Faciality and the Digital Politics of Identity, in which she talks about the advent of facial recognition software and how the face as a site of biopolitical governance can both connect and disconnect. But before we delve into this topic, I would like to ask you to tell me a bit about your own background and how it is you came to write for a book centered around the theme of connectivity. What's your connection there?
Oh, that's a very good question. My background, as far as academia is concerned, I studied international relations, and for me, this is all about connectivity, how global politics works, how states, but also how interact with each other and connect with each other, but also how societies within states operate. So this is also, for me, one of the bases of perhaps of my understanding of international relations is the relationality aspect. So my personal background, my biographical background, my last name, people always ask me, how do you pronounce my last name? That's because my grandfather came from Switzerland and met my grandmother here in Germany. They were then forced to flee during the Nazi era, and my father grew up in Paraguay in South America, later emigrated to the United States and met my mother, whose own parents were immigrants from Ireland, and I grew up in the United Kingdom and now live in Berlin. So perhaps that's a nice way of geographically setting the context of connectivities, that I grew up without any particular national identity as such, but having very much the sense of always being connected to different peoples, different backgrounds. My father's background was so different from my mother's. That this established, I think, a lot to do with my own identity and my ways of understanding the world itself. So that
makes perfect sense. So a bit of a patchwork of all nations in your background. Very interesting. So you write a chapter about facial recognition software, and you start by with an anecdote about the Roman god Janus, because one of these softwares, it's named after Janus. And I was wondering if you could tell me just a bit who this god was, what he stood for, and what are the implications of invoking a Roman god in facial recognition software? Because to me, this is a very deliberate choice. It carries a certain weight and pretense of pre-existence if you name it after a former god that people worshipped.
Indeed, and it's fascinating to see how many security firms and companies, institutions in the security and surveillance branch that invoke the name of this Roman god Janus. It's quite fascinating, so widespread. So he obviously invokes his symbolisms, obviously invokes something very much to do with modern imaginations of connectivities, modern imaginations concerning spaces of governance. Now, for example, the one example I use in my chapter is that of the IARPA, which is an organization within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the US, charged with expanding facial recognition capabilities. Their Janus program, if you go on their webpage, you see immediately not only the name Janus, but also an image of a representation of this two-faced god. And many people would immediately associate this god with its two faces, but he was also a god with many powers and capabilities that resonate with the themes of this book and of my chapter in particular. So he had the ability to look both forward and backward in time, which is with his two faces. So this is very interesting when we think about how imaginaries of connectivity relate to novel spaces of governance in time, and what facial technologies and facial recognition technologies now seek to not only identify individuals, but also to preempt and prevent possibilities of emergent threat, and also even to read behavioral profiling technologies, for example, to be able to read affectively the emotions and the possible intent or pretext of potential suspects. So going back to Janus, the god, he was the god of transitions, the god of journeys and exchange, the god of travels, and he watched over gateways and doorways. So this is very interesting because my chapter looks at the face not only as a site and site of connectivity, but also as a site of borders and bordering practices. So Janus was also the god of transitions between war and peace. His gates were opened in times of war and closed in times of peace. So there's so many issues and thematics that we can pick out throughout from his symbolisms, and perhaps most strikingly, he was the god of transitions and change. So he had a lot to do with novelty. So perhaps that's enough on that subject, but it's really quite fascinating to see, to note the renaissances of this Roman god of antiquity and modern imaginaries.
That's exactly what I thought, and there is a lot to unpack there in the symbology. And actually, it's you mentioned this, and I was going to ask you, why do we need a software that can not only recognize people's faces, but even assess their threat level, or their, is this full-on behavioral profiling necessary at airports or border controls? What reasons do the organizations give for such control, such a step beyond simply recognizing faces?
The reasons that, for example, the head of the program being developed within the European Union, unfortunately I can't pronounce his name, it's a bit complicated, but was the ability to establish what he calls biomarkers of deceit. Now, this is a very interesting term that he uses, biomarkers. It says something, again, about the imaginaries that are behind this kind of technologies. So they seek to, how this works is the technology uses algorithms to analyze micro expressions of facial systems, of the face, such as eye movements and the pupil, voice, tone, etc., to be able to differentiate whether a person is lying or telling the truth. Now, this need for this double layer of security is quite fascinating, because it's not enough to match a person's identity and match him with somebody who has previously been identified as a potential threat or as threat, but to look even at this in real time. And again, here we have the question of time, which is a very important element of the book and other chapters as well. The post 9/11 world, as I explore in my chapter, is one where the issue of time and how facial recognition systems operate is they operate in real time. So the ability not only to match a known criminal or terrorist with those stored in a facial recognition database, but also to predict a potential criminal or a potential deceiver, is the ability, let's think about Janus again, the ability to look into the future. So these are very interesting developments. Yeah, and where was I going with this? I've forgotten, never mind.
Oh, that's okay. Perhaps I can segue this into the next question, because going beyond facial recognition and predicting someone's behavior based on these biomarkers you mentioned, I wanted to ask if this, obviously this novel mapping of the face, as you put it in your chapter, can be argued to increase connectivity between people and across borders, but does it not also have the potential to disconnect groups of people, to discriminate against certain facial expressions, certain types of faces? Can you tell us a bit more about this double-edged sword of being able to connect and disconnect?
Right. This again has many levels. Perhaps one very striking case was studies done on Amazon's recognition program, which is a software called a facial recognition software called Recognition that Amazon then began selling to US government agencies, in particular a number of big cities. These programs have now, Amazon now says it's not going to sell surveillance to government institutions anymore. However, studies done on this recognition software showed that it tended to misidentify as well as, so it didn't simply identify individuals, it also misidentified individuals, particularly those people of color. So it did indeed discriminate against people of color, which is a big potential problem for these systems.
Mm-hmm.
That's perhaps the most striking example, but there's many other ways where we can also see how the connectivity of the face itself, which is seen as a potential, you can unlock your phone, you can unlock your laptop, you can gain access to buildings, example, or other examples of facial recognition software, but how it connects, but we can see in many other ways, indeed, especially in the post 9/11 surveillance and security world in which we live, how the self-governance, especially in the post 9/11 world in which we live, how the borders are now becoming embedded and mobilized within bodies, as other thinkers have already pointed out, such as Louisa Moore, for example, how the border is becoming embedded within biological human bodies. And what my chapter looks at is how the face is itself becoming a border. So we can look at this in a very critical way to think about how the face connects, but how it is also becoming a border, and who is allowed to access certain things, who is allowed to cross borders, and how what role the face and the connectivities of the face plays here.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point to end this on. Miss Huessy, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully until next time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.